All right, let's now bring in Professor Hennie Strydom, Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg, to help us unpack this legally. Prof, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. So we understand there are very specific conditions under which a country can take military action against another, and on top of that, capture its president, as we've seen. So under the UN Charter also, it states that states are prohibited from using force against political independence, if it were, of another state. So on what basis then, legal basis, if any, could the US justify this military strike?
The US can only use military force against another country in self-defense. That is clearly stipulated by Article 51 of the UN Charter. And for that to happen, there must be a clear indication that there's an imminent threat to the United States by means of the military force used by another country. And this is not the case here. Even the United States has, and I think partly wrongly so, classified this as police action because apparently, that's what we've been told, the FBI has arrested Maduro. But even so, the FBI was supported by massive military power, a massive military force. So clearly that constitutes a violation of a basic principle, which you just mentioned, of the UN Charter.
Yeah, and of course we are monitoring developments, of the UN Security Council. So given what you're saying, that the recognized exceptions to the prohibition on force are UN Security Council authorization, or rather what other experts have also told us. We know, of course, that the Council meets today, and self-defense under Article 51. What I'm hearing is that neither threshold has been met in this case. So again, what does that make of the US action legally?
Well, none of the reasons put forward by the United States, the drug trafficking, the weapons, the oil issue, the disintegration of the country on a
Prof, are you still with us?
Therefore, it is a clear unlawful act that the United States has resorted to in order to capture Maduro.
Yeah. Let's talk then about Maduro. I'm going to come back to the international law. You mentioned, of course, the charges. Maduro will make his first court appearance in New York's federal court later today, together with his wife, Celia Flores. I mean, they're facing a number of charges, including, according to this indictment sheet, narco terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons charges. Speak to us about just the seriousness of these charges and what we are likely then to expect for these two to then be charged in a US court.
It depends on what can be proved. I do not have the facts available to the United States prosecuting authority. So maybe we can assume that they've properly prepared for the matter and that everything is placed to go ahead with the prosecution, and that they have a reasonable prospect of success. So, but there's also the defense side, which will have to be submitted to court and for the court then to consider in making a final decision. But there's a very other interesting international law, and in some cases also a domestic law principle under the laws of some countries. And that is where an unlawful kidnapping has taken place of a fugitive in another country and brought to the country exercising the force to stand trial. The courts of that country may not have jurisdiction. This is a clear principle on the South African law. If South Africa would capture somebody by force under unlawful circumstances, bring back that person to South Africa to stand trial, the South African courts will just refuse to hear the matter. This issue is gray, is falling in the gray area in the United States of America, as I understand American law. So we will have to see where this argument will also be taken up and presented to the court, and how the court will then decide upon it. And at this point in time, it's all an open question, because we do not know what the defense will put forward during the proceedings and what the state will argue on the other side. So it's now very much a wait-and-see game that we will have to contemplate.
Yeah, and in terms of international law and protections, I mean, what protections does international law afford a sitting head of state, whether there's contestation about that particular individual or not, as in the case of Maduro, including of course, personal immunity and, as you've indicated there, about jurisdiction and protections?
Well, I don't think in the case of the immunity issue, that a head of state can claim that with official duties in terms of the criminal law activities. And in fact, this is something that will be dealt with under the law of the United States in terms of immunities and jurisdiction. So it's entirely a domestic law issue at this point in time concerning the legal proceedings before the US court. Which is a separate issue to a certain extent of the unlawful abduction of Maduro by military force in his own country.
Yeah, and in terms of the UN Security Council meeting later today, of course, we know that the US also has that powerful veto position. What are we likely to expect in terms of, just from a legal perspective, from other members?
Well, if we can sort of look at examples, let me give you the Russian invasion of Ukraine as one example, which was likewise a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. And when that matter was debated in the Security Council, and the Security Council had to decide on a resolution, it was vetoed by Russia, who is one of the permanent members of the Security Council. So if we get to that stage and there's a condemnatory resolution to be adopted by the Security Council in the case of the United States, I can guarantee you that the United States will use its veto power to block that decision. And this is what we can expect if we get to that stage of the adoption of a resolution.
Yeah. Prof, I want to just bring in this last question as we wrap up our conversation. I mean, just having looked at the various interpretations of what we are seeing before us. I mean, there's so many questions around international law, how it's enforced and when it applies. So if international law only applies then when powerful states choose to observe it, and if sovereignty can be suspended by, these unilateral declarations, then who really decides the exemption and what remains of the rules-based international order? Is this where, for instance, the ICJ comes in? I mean, help us clear this murkiness.
Well, Venezuela will still have, or may still have, a remedy before the International Court of Justice. So if all else fails, and to get a ruling from the ICJ on America's action and what it entails and what remedies there are. But here is a tricky issue concerning this, whether Venezuela will indeed consider that. Because from what we hear, there seems to be some form of cooperation, I do not know how extensive and what nature, between the new president, the vice president who just been sworn in, and the United States of America on how to take this forward. So if there is going to be a cooperation between the two countries on America's involvement, I see little chance of Venezuela also deciding in those circumstances to take the matter to the ICJ. But still, we do not have the full picture at this point in time, and we do not have the full facts that will regulate the situation as we go forward.
Absolutely, Prof. Let's leave it there for now, of course, as we monitor these various developments. Professor Hennie Strydom, Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg, thank you so much for your insights.